Thank you so much, Cyrus. That's stunning as always. Just amazing. So our next reader is Debra Monroe. Debra is the author of 4 books of fiction and 2 memoirs. Her first book won the Flannery O'Connor Award for fiction. She has published essays in many journals, including Salon, the New York Times, Longreads, Guernica, and is regularly cited in Best American Essays. Deb?
Thank you, Malvern Books. It's cool that it's so cool that you keep small presses and poetry alive in the community the way you do. And I met you all at the same time, you know, pretty much like 21 years ago was when we met. Because I met Naomi when my daughter was like 3 weeks old, and we were at the Inter-South Book Fair. She was promoting a children's book, Lullaby Raft, and my daughter was 3 weeks old. And I was with this Simon & Schuster rep who didn't know what to do with the author, who kept feeding a baby every 3 hours. and she gave me the Lullaby Raft, which is such a beautiful book, those socks in the drawers. And that's about the time you came to Texas State. And I just want to say there's a lot of people in this room. Those of you I don't know, I'm sorry if it seems over-familiar with the rest of you. There's a lot of people in this room that I love very much. So it's good to see you all. So someone was joking when I came in that you might need trigger warnings to hear me read, because I've been publishing a lot lately about rape and white supremacy, but I thought I'd keep it light today. So. Okay. And in fact, you've heard of love poems, I'm sure. Well, I thought I would write a love essay. I know that sounds kind of prosaic. And I did, but the irony is, of course, I could never stay on the subject, which was my husband. And then, but you know, essays are supposed to be digressive. And then also, that other irony is he hates compliments, so it's a good thing he's not here. He would just be dying in the corner. Okay. It's called My Taciturn Valentine. My first date took me by snowmobile to a tavern that served minors. We didn't speak as the snowmobile roared through woods. We wore helmets besides. In the tavern, we removed our helmets, but the jukebox throbbed loud polkas, and up and down the bar, raucous elders traded insults. My exhilaration that night came from proximity, not conversation, the brand new buzzing knowledge that the nearby body belonged with mine. Whether the strong silent lover found in books and movies caused me to believe in the strong silent lover sitting near me on the bar stool, or the fantasy of the strong silent lover sitting near me on the bar stool, near any woman, causes his double to recur in art, is a chicken or egg question. Yet women will fill the silence well. They customize it. Every night I give my body to my husband like a chalice. A woman wrote in a letter to Ann Landers I read as a schoolgirl, my interest piquing. As long as my boyfriend didn't talk, he was a void into which I poured thoughts so profound he apparently found them inexpressible. Meanwhile, in the wilds of my youth, lingo from hunting and fishing pervaded the discourse of love. On the prowl, the one that got away, jailbait, she fell for him hook, line, and sinker. This implied a distinction between predator and prey. Men were predators and women were prey, right? Everyone knows that a woman in hot pursuit makes a tactical error, but a man in hot pursuit is virile. And rivals seemed to await my boyfriend's inattention, so strong was a necessary attribute too. One evening, the radio was tuned to a top 40 station 500 miles away. Strange as it seems now, John Denver's song about his ex-wife sounded like poetry. Reasonable poetry for a man who hunted and fished, I thought, eyeing my boyfriend. Night in the forest, mountains in springtime. He could discuss these. Maybe they filled up his senses. But he couldn't make the next leap and equate bliss in the woods with bliss he felt spending time with me. Could I spend the rest of my life never hearing words like these? A few days later, ironing my father's shirts, I decided I couldn't. I wanted to go to college. Did I go to college to find an eloquent lover? People have gone to college for less. I moved to a small city where one of my professors explained that when a male character in a 19th century novel declares himself, our satisfaction has been whetted by the long delay. True, years of waiting for real boyfriends to say something reckless and extraordinary increased my thrill when Heathcliff said to Catherine, with all the powers of his puny being, he couldn't love as much in 80 years as I could in a day. If by real-life standards a surly, obsessive suitor is stalker material, in literature he's irresistible. I'm a professor now, and last semester a student raced into my office, shut the door, told me she'd met Mr. Rochester. He hardly spoke, she added. His passion was unrelenting. They didn't want to be apart. I wondered how she knew this if he didn't speak. Perhaps she was thinking of the real Mr. Rochester, who told Jane Eyre not to leave, or, quote, the cord of communion will be snapped. I sent my warning in code. I emphasized to the student the power and equity between Mr. Rochester and Jane, how Mr. Rochester's humbling at the end, blindness, isn't feasible or even desirable. The student ignored me, a killjoy, and resumed her daydream. But I understand. By the time I was in graduate school, I dreamed at night about John Donne. He looked like he does in the portrait for which he stripped naked to pose in his shroud, also like the professor who read John Donne's poems aloud in class. Did John Donne speak in my dreams? Not often, but it was worth the wait. At first, smart, sexy analogies. As we grew closer, passionate avowals. Later, unflinching spiritual insight. John Donne was the total package. A gap developed between my ideal and the real men I met. One night I kissed a classmate because he said Robert Coover's work was an assault on the cliche-ridden templates society imposes on us. He wore a toupee that didn't quite match his remaining hair. This was before balding men shaved their heads to reveal voila, the phallic head. And I felt if he'd quit wearing the toupee, he'd not only look better, but people would stop joking about it behind his back. Kissing, I'd tilt this way and that, obliging him to tilt, hoping the swaying would cause him to fling off the toupee and say something ardent about kissing as an assault on cliche-ridden whatevers. He never unveiled his head, nor his innermost self, though I'm sure some woman one day found both. I looked him up on Facebook. Not true. Discouraged, I married a silent man. Even his mother made the case that his silence masked strength. His mother loomed large in his secret with mythology, I quickly realized, because the only endearments forthcoming were baby talk. Private noises he should keep to himself, I felt. So I pretended not to hear, and his silence was as exquisite as the emotions I ascribed to it. Then I had a slow, difficult miscarriage, and he quit his job and disappeared for a few days. His feelings were so overwhelming he couldn't talk to me or his boss, his mother said, or go to the store for items I needed, or look for another job again ever. In time, I knew this and other unsettling facts the silence had concealed. I got divorced and took a job at a state university. The house I could afford was deep in the country. By then, I'd earned 3 degrees and published a few books. With nothing to distract me but the sound of birdsong and rushing wind, I worked. I also traveled to far-off conferences where every year or so I fell in love. I substituted letters for physical contact longer than most women would because I lived so far from men I'd date. Verification of the spark, mere theory until words become flesh, required a road trip or plane ticket. I got seduced in 3 genres: poetry, fiction, and screenwriting. These men taught in provincial university towns too. We'd visit when we could. Mostly we gave good letter. No one takes a scrim of rapport, a rough draft of emotion, and turns it into love faster than a writer. Poesis, making something from nothing. I know the appeal of a sentence contorted to please its reader, a glimmer of sentiment solidifying to a point. I sent my Kama Sutra of syntax back. Love letter lovers are like silent men who don't contradict the fantasy because love letters are edited. Loving an absent writer is like loving John Donne, though in truth, no one was that good. Still, if bonding hormones are released by vivid memories artfully retold, in time you remember the depiction, not the moment. As the number of letters surpassed hours spent together, the affairs fizzled. At home, in the village near my house, I met men who might qualify as Byronic heroes in that their pursuit seemed unstoppable. One followed me to the hardware store, then to the grocery store, then to a gift shop that sold office supplies, then to the gas station where I asked what he wanted. He stared at the ground and said he was hoping we could go for barbecue. Another time I was at the post office waiting in line to mail a package, and a man memorized my return address. How do I know? He told me the next day when he came to my house and recited a poem he wrote, its rhyme scheme dependent on words with T-I-O-N endings, as in, all this perspiration due to love's vibration. Cyrus lived in this town.
Yeah. So I did witness some of this.
I wanted someone who wanted me so badly he'd say so, but I wanted to take him out in public. The real value of epistolary love affairs became obvious after I adopted my daughter. By the time she was 4, I'd gone on blind dates arranged by friends in neighboring cities. That would be San Antonio and Austin. There weren't theaters or restaurants where I lived. I didn't want dates coming to the house, serial uncles dragged through my child's life. A drive to a city was 2 hours round trip for me, twice that for a man who'd pick me up and drive me home. So the idea of dating was better than dating. Once I had 2 hard-to-arrange dates with a novelist who lived in one of the cities. He told me he was going to Europe, but he wanted to stay in touch because he'd be back. I'd begun to develop early stages of a disease that made me too tired to do more than I already did. Go to work, come home, grade papers, cook, get my daughter ready for bed, take her to school. But every night I read emails from Prague. It was a conversation so good we had trouble ending it. Days before his return, he wrote to say that he had a new girlfriend. Rereading all of his letters, I pinpointed the exact weekend he'd met this new girlfriend. I didn't feel lovelorn. I felt like a story had ended abruptly. I met my husband a few years later. He lived in one of the neighboring cities, and we both had school-aged children, so we saw each other a few times a month. Sometimes we called each other, but phone conversations require simultaneous free time, so we emailed. What were his emails like? He writes statutes for a living, so his letters demonstrated clarity, precision, and mastery of the subordinate clause, which he needed because he was always making provisions for unlikely exceptions to the rule. He'd write on the morning of a date to say, we're 95% set, though there's a slim chance I might get called into the office, or my son or my parents might need me. The first time he wrote this, I thought he was foreshadowing a late-in-the-day cancellation because he'd lost interest or met someone new. But our dates came off without a hitch, except the day his mother needed to go to the ER. At first, this refusal to say, I'll be there, and to say instead, barring emergencies, I'll be there, seemed like an occupational tick, not a sign of indelible loyalty ratified and henceforth applied. Then my illness got worse. I needed a 6-hour test. He suggested my daughter go to the sitters. He took the day off work. A nurse shoved a tube into my arm. He looked unhappy. That night he looked more unhappy. I worried what my test results might reveal. I also worried I'd let him see too much. With feigned nonchalance, I said, "You seem out of sorts." He took a long time answering, then said, if it turns out you're really ill, I'd take care of you, my son, my parents, and I'd raise your daughter. So no, I don't feel romantic right now. I feel overwhelmed. I tensed up. I thought about saying I didn't need his help, also that he had lousy bedside patter. Then I stopped. I realized that all the consoling words stowed in moldering envelopes or on some now discarded hard drive had never cared, not literally. One summer while I traveled for work, he drove 100 miles to my daughter's camp to deliver medicine she forgot to pack. He taught his son to drive, never once raising his voice. He held a gauze compress over his father's nosebleed one night from midnight until dawn. Sometimes I tell him how happy I am to be eating dinner with him, or reading books together by lamplight, or conferring about how to handle a tricky parenting moment. He'll say, "All that you just said, yes." I'm happy too. My tribute, hopefully better than John Denver's, falling short of John Donne's, is imbalanced. So many paragraphs describing the silent men who weren't strong, or the articulate men who were or weren't strong, but were too far away and, like me, not wary enough about the ways that words aren't the adequate expression of every reality. Only a few paragraphs describe the love of my complicated days and nights, my husband, who promises only what he can and delivers more. He doesn't trust compliments anyway, so it's not for him that I say he's not silent, but he is strong. Saying so doesn't make strong stronger, but I, word junkie, just can't stop.